Hi everyone, thank you for joining us tonight. Just curious, was anyone here at the rally a year ago down in Kerr Street for the original protest? So quite a few. So you can all attest to how cold it was that day. I think people really showed how much they cared about democracy simply by standing out there and freezing for so many hours. Luckily we're inside tonight and we even have hot drinks and snacks, so that's a big improvement there. Another difference is instead of just listening to people, you're going to get your own chance to speak, your own ideas to express them at the end, which I think is more consistent with democracy as well as consistent with our goals as CAPP. My talk tonight can basically be broken into two parts: reasons for hope and reasons to be worried. In the interest of ending on a positive note, I'll start with the reasons to be worried. Why should we worry about democracy in Canada? The first answer that probably pops into a lot of people's minds here tonight is probably Stephen Harper. It's the easy answer. He gets a lot of blame for our perceived lack of democracy in Canada right now. But I would argue there's only so much damage that one person can do. Things weren't exactly in great shape before Mr. Harper came along, and I mean, it's kind of silly to think that one person can come in and just destroy a whole democratic foundation. For just one example of things that have been going on is the steady accumulation of power in the hands of the executive, in the hands of prime ministers, which has taken power away from our elected MPs to speak their minds or to represent their constituents. This has been going on for at least 3 decades now, and certainly Mr. Harper did not invent that. However, if things weren't great when Stephen Harper took power, they haven't exactly gotten any better. There's been a number of troubling developments in the past year alone, and two that leap to my mind very easily are the Omnibus Bill and the defeat of Bill C-311 by the Senate. Bill C-9, known as the Omnibus Bill, dealt mainly with the budget, but it also contained a number of other measures in its 900 or so pages. These included relaxing environmental regulation and the privatization of Atomic Energy Canada and parts of Canada Post. But because it was related to the budget, it was a matter of confidence, and therefore defeating this bill would have triggered an election. In my opinion, the government used this threat of an election to push through legislation which should have been voted on separately. That's one thing. Then in the fall, without any debate whatsoever, the Senate killed Bill C-311, otherwise known as the Climate Change Accountability Act, which had already been passed by the House of Commons. This is very significant. It's estimated at least 70 years since the last time this happened that the unelected Senate defeated a piece of legislation passed by the democratically elected House of Commons. And there's a whole range of things that go into. Some of the previous speakers mentioned other reasons to be concerned about democracy, but I only have 8 minutes, so I can't get up here and list like an hour's worth of problems. There's one common element to these, and the prorogation is included. It's the fact that the House of Commons is always the loser. It's always our democratically elected representatives who sit in the House of Commons who end up getting sidelined. And this is ironic because the Canadian system is supposed to be one of parliamentary supremacy. In other words, the Parliament holds government accountable. The whole idea is that the people, through their elected representatives, control government, not vice versa. So regular sidelining of the House of Commons and of Parliament is certainly a reason to be worried about democracy in Canada. But democracy is not just about what government does, it's also about people too. I would say another, perhaps more powerful reason to be concerned is, as Marion mentioned, the apathy that seems to dominate these days, the cynicism, the lack of interest in our democracy. Voter turn rates continue to drop, election after election, leading to an all-time low of 58% in the 2008 election. And on top of that, people these days don't participate as much in things like political parties or civic groups or activist clubs or whatnot as much as they used to, and the trends are even worse amongst young people. And there's a lot of different explanations as to why people don't vote. Certainly government scandals and hyper-partisanship turn people off of politics, but if I were to offer my opinion, one possible reason is because governments these days just don't do as much as they used to. A lot of the issues, the debates, and the policies that made up the content or the real meat of democracy in the 50s, 60s, and 70s are off the table these days, especially when you start talking about the economy. The government just takes a hands-off approach and the private sector is allowed to fill in the gaps. A lot of time globalization or free trade is used as an excuse for this. It's thought that since companies can pull investment out of a country so easily, that if taxation gets too high or if regulation gets too burdensome, that basically our economy will revert to some sort of third world situation. But as governments do less, there's simply less to get excited about in politics. There's less reason to follow it. There's less reason to vote. Sometimes governments are apologetic about not doing that much. They get swept in a tide of reform, and they just sort of turn around and shrug their shoulders once in power and say, well, sorry. And they continue doing exactly what the previous government did. No matter who you vote for, you're likely to get the same outcome, so why bother voting anyways, as has been mentioned before. But there are other governments who seem to revel in cutting things back, shrinking things, doing nothing. I like to call these self-loathing governments. They have a complex where they hate themselves, they hate being government, and they want to shrink it as much as possible. They want to cut it. They even talk about taking the axe to government. Some nice violent imagery there. In their view, anything the public sector does is automatically worse than anything the private sector does. It's important to realize, though, that there are differences between the public and the private sector, and these have serious consequences for democracy. In the public sector, in our democracy, in our political system, we're all equal. We all get one vote. I know it doesn't work perfectly. Maybe I'm just an optimist, but I do like to think that if a determined majority could always have its way over a rich and powerful minority. That's the public sector, though. You don't get that in the private sector. What is it like in the private sector? Well, maybe a quote or a slogan you might have heard these days would be appropriate. Have you ever heard the slogan, vote with your dollar? Companies use this a lot. A lot of environmental or ethical companies will do this, and I like those companies, but I don't like the slogan, vote with your dollar, simply because, of course, not everyone has the same amount of dollars. If not everyone has the same amount of dollars, then if we vote with our dollar, then some people are going to get more votes, some people are going to get less votes, and some people aren't going to get any votes at all. As governments do less and the private sector does more, the decisions that shape our lives are increasingly influenced by how much money we have, and not by the principle of one person, one vote. And this not only hollows out democracy, but I think it really turns people off. There's just less reason to care about it. You might as well devote yourself to your career, to getting more money. There's not really that much that can be accomplished by voting, by joining a party. So if that's more than enough reasons to be worried about democracy, I'll try in my last section to give some reasons to be hopeful for democracy. Although unfortunately I do admit this last section is a lot shorter than the first section. First and foremost, I think the prorogation protests themselves were a reason to be hopeful. They were one of the biggest mass political movements in recent Canadian history. At the time, I think the government was just sort of hoping people wouldn't care. They wouldn't care about prorogation. They wouldn't care if Parliament was shut down. And I think the message put forward by all the people of different backgrounds that gathered on January 23rd last year was that we do care. We care about our democracy. So maybe this apathy is exaggerated. It's not as big as it might appear to be. Beyond that, the protests had more of a lasting significance than a one-day event. They led to the formation of groups like this, like Oakville CAPP, all across the country. There are at least 20 CAPP chapters working in Canada right now, trying to promote discussion on democracy, participation in democracy. I know in Oakville's case, we brought new people into political activism that maybe had never been involved in a group like that before. And that's pretty significant when you start bringing new people in. There are other groups also forming, like RODC, that are concerned with democracy. There's a real groundswell right now of energy and interest in this. So there's a wider perception that what we have isn't working and that we need to get it working again. Another reason for optimism might be, this is kind of a cliche, but I'll say the election of Obama. If you forget about the dramatic disappointment and disillusionment that was displayed in the recent election, the simple fact that he could mobilize such enthusiasm, and to my mind, enthusiasm from young voters, was really significant. This says to me that this apathy isn't permanent. Maybe people are just waiting for the right inspiration. However, Obama also demonstrates to me the danger of waiting for some knight in shining armor to ride up and save us, to save our democracy, to save our environment, or to save whatever it is we want to be saved. Just as Stephen Harper can't single-handedly destroy democracy, neither can any one person save it. In my opinion, it's really only the people that can save their democracy. And I think a good way for them to start, a good way for us all to start, is to meet together at gatherings like this, where we can talk about politics, we can talk about democracy. A lot of things in history have started with just a small group of people getting together and talking. And if I were to offer one final solution, I think, to help us restore our democracy, and of course I'm speaking now in the perspective of, I'm with the NDP, so I'm a lefty. Don Cherry would call me a pinko, and I in fact do ride a bike too. So this is my lefty perspective, but it's to recapture our imagination of what democracy can accomplish, of what politics can accomplish, and to move back from this political discourse where all anybody talks about is how much taxes can be cut. I think that's not exactly healthy for democracy. As I said before, if there's nothing left for governments to do, then there's no real reason to care about democracy. It might as well go the way of the dodo, because there's no decisions left to be made. So is democracy broken? I would say not quite yet. Not yet. I certainly don't think it's doing very good, but I don't think it's beyond repair if people really decide they want it to be fixed.